Depending on how old you are, you may not remember Milton Bradley from when you were a kid. But if you don't, I guarantee that your parents do. And your grandparents. And maybe your great-grandparents as well. Milton Bradley was the name in board games and childhood educational products for over 100 years. How did they become such a dominating force in the industry for so long? And why are they no longer around? This is Milton Bradley, a century of innovation.
Milton Bradley was born on November 8th, 1836. Though the story of the company that bears his name doesn't really start until he opened the first color lithography shop in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1860.
One of the first major projects he undertook in his lithography shop was a portrait of then presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln. Believing that the portraits were to become a major seller, Milton Bradley printed quite a number of them, to have them all become completely useless due to the fact that Abraham Lincoln had grown in his trademark beard and was now unrecognizable from his earlier portraits. This single event is credited with causing the failure of Milton Bradley's lithography shop.
During that same year, distraught over the failure of his lithography business, Bradley went to his old friend George Tapley. During his visit, Tapley challenged him to an unknown European board game. Playing that game sparked the idea for Bradley to change businesses, as no one was making board games in the U.S. at this time.
In the winter of 1860, Milton Bradley released his first board game, The Checkered Game of Life. The game was very similar to many roll and move games popular in Europe at the time. One of the few major differences was the use of a teetotum or spinner instead of dice to determine how far you moved. This was actually a very important change for the American market for roll and move games because dice were very much associated in America at the time with gambling. And without the dice, people could regard this game as a family game.
By the next year, 1861, customers bought nearly 45,000 copies of The Checkered Game of Life. For its day, this was enough of a success to reverse Bradley's fortunes. But 1861 also saw the beginning of the Civil War.
Milton Bradley temporarily gave up making board games to try to make new weaponry for the war effort for the North. While doing this, he noticed that soldiers were bringing board games with them to play on the front lines during downtime during the war. It was then that Milton Bradley had a stroke of genius that led to his invention of the travel game.
In 1861, the Milton Bradley Company produced travel versions of chess, checkers, backgammon, dominoes, and the Checkered Game of Life. These travel games were a big hit with soldiers.
During the 1860s, Milton Bradley became heavily involved in the kindergarten movement, and he began directing his company to make educational products to help support that movement. During this time, the company produced educational games, wooden blocks, colored paper and paint, and many other educational items that Milton Bradley directed his company to give away for free to help promote the kindergarten movement.
During the 1870s, the company started producing various different parlor and educational games. They also started capitalizing on fads. Milton Bradley was the first company in America to start making croquet sets.
The investors in the Milton Bradley Company were very happy and pleased with the money being made off of parlor games as well as the fad items that they produced, but they were far less happy about the money they were losing because of the fact that Milton Bradley had decided to give away all of those educational items they were making for free to continue to help promote the kindergarten movement.
The investors told Milton Bradley that he had to give up his kindergarten work or they would leave the company and sell their interests.
Bradley chose to call their bluff and chose to keep making the kindergarten products. Though, after the investors had left the company, Milton Bradley's old friend George Tapley, yes, that George Tapley, the very same man who inspired Milton Bradley to start a board game company in the first place, bought up all of the lost interest from those investors, and became the president of the Milton Bradley Company.
In 1880, the company began selling jigsaw puzzles. By the year 1900, the Milton Bradley Company had become synonymous with educational products amongst kindergartens. The company now transitioned into selling their kindergarten products.
The educational products were now a cornerstone of the Milton Bradley business, though they did still produce many parlor games.
On May 30th, 1911, Milton Bradley died.
1911 to 1920 saw a time of great uncertainty in regards to the leadership of the Milton Bradley Company. The control of the company first went to Robert Ellis, who then turned it over to Milton Bradley's son-in-law, Robert Ingersoll. Robert Ingersoll, in turn, later turned the company over to the son of George Tapley, William Tapley.
In 1920, the company bought McLaughlin Brothers, a children's book company, so they could expand into the book market.
The 1920s saw a decline in the business of the Milton Bradley Company. That decline dropped into a plummet in the 1930s after the start of the Great Depression, as most people had far less expendable income.
The board of directors was panicking. In their desperation, they turned to James J. Shea, a successful Springfield businessman, to take over as president.
Shea immediately implemented a major renovation of the Milton Bradley plant. He also took to burning up lots of unsold inventory that had just been taking up space, slowly building up in the plant since the turn of the century.
After the outbreak of World War II, Shea invented a universal joint to be used in the manufacture of fighter plane landing gear. He also directed the company to produce revised versions of their travel games to be sold to soldiers on the front line. These new travel games earned the company more than $2 million.
Shea drastically cut the number of titles in print, bringing Milton Bradley's number of in-print games from 410 all the way down to 150, cutting many titles that just had not been selling. In addition, he began introducing brand new board game titles to their library.
One of these new titles was Chutes and Ladders. It was released in 1943. It was based on the ancient game Snakes and Ladders from India.
Another of the new games introduced during this time was Candyland. First introduced in 1949, Candyland would go on to become a major staple of Milton Bradley's childhood board game line.
In 1959, Milton Bradley would release a home version of the TV game show Concentration. The game was such a huge success that Milton Bradley went on to release annual editions all the way up until 1982, even though the TV show had been canceled in 1973.
Following the success of Concentration, Milton Bradley would go on to release many more board games based on TV shows and game shows, including their very popular releases of Password and Jeopardy!
In 1960, to celebrate the centennial anniversary of the Milton Bradley Company, they decided to re-release the Checkered Game of Life. The modernized version was now shortened to The Game of Life, and the goal was to become a millionaire instead of just to reach a happy old age.
Another huge hit game for Milton Bradley in the 1960s was Twister. The game went on to sell like hotcakes after being featured on an episode of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. During the episode, Johnny Carson played a game of Twister with Ava Gabor. During the game, he made many lewd jokes and innuendos. That episode spurred the sales of Twister to transcend normal game sales and become a true cultural phenomenon.
In 1967, James Shea Jr. became president of the Milton Bradley Company. Later, in 1968, he became CEO. Shea Jr. directed Milton Bradley to buy Play School and the E.S. Lowe Company. They were the makers of Body Language and Yahtzee.
In 1967, Milton Bradley would release another game that would go on to become a staple of many people's board game collections for years to come. Battleship.
In 1971, they released the real-time, dexterity-based game Crossfire, which would have multiple releases up through the 80s.
In 1974, Milton Bradley released the now iconic children's game Connect 4.
In 1978, wanting to capitalize on the new electronic game craze, Milton Bradley released Simon. By the year 1980, it had become their bestseller and went on to become a cultural phenomenon.
In 1979, continuing to try to capitalize on the electronic gaming craze, Milton Bradley developed the very first handheld, cartridge-based video game console, the Microvision. To put this into some perspective, Nintendo's Game Boy was not released until a full 10 years later, in 1989.
The Microvision was a moderate success, grossing $5 million its first year. It had died by 1981 because of lack of games and small screen size.
In 1981, in order to both continue capitalizing on the electronic gaming craze, as well as capitalize on the new fantasy gaming craze that was kicked off by the previous release of Dungeons & Dragons, Milton Bradley released the board game Dark Tower. Dark Tower was a fantasy adventure board game where the titular tower was an electronic component that was a three-dimensional tower in the middle of the board.
The game was only produced for a short amount of time due to a lawsuit by Alan Coleman and Roger Burton, who claimed that they had brought the concept to Milton Bradley in the late 70s. Its short production time and interesting gimmick caused the Dark Tower game to become a highly sought-after collectible.
In 1983, Milton Bradley bought General Consumer Electronics because of their development of a new video game console, the Vectrex. The Vectrex was a vector-based video game console with an integral monitor. Though the Vectrex went off the market in 1984 because of the video game crash, it maintains a cult following to this day where people still make video games for it.
In the 1980s, Milton Bradley started the Game Master series to publish small release games that had a more advanced feel. In 1984, they published Axis and Allies, Broadsides and Boarding Parties, and Conquest of the Empire. In 1986, they released Fortress America and Shogun, which was later renamed Samurai Swords.
During this time in 1984, the Milton Bradley Company was purchased by Hasbro. This was the first time in 124 years that Milton Bradley was not a family-owned company.
In 1986, Milton Bradley published the cult classic Fireball Island.
Around this time, Milton Bradley was also working with a partnership with Games Workshop out of the United Kingdom to produce board games based on their Warhammer Fantasy Miniatures game. Two notable creations in this time were Hero Quest, which was released in 1989, and Battle Masters, which came out in 1992.
After this time, Hasbro exerted more and more control over their subsidiary, focusing on evergreen titles instead of coming up with new concepts.
In 2009, Hasbro finally made the decision to retire the Milton Bradley name and instead began printing the Hasbro logo on all of their board game releases.
Milton Bradley created the American board game market. He invented travel games and was behind many innovations for over 100 years. Milton Bradley the man was even partially responsible for why kids go to kindergarten today. Milton Bradley was once the most important name in board games, and even though the name doesn't appear on game boxes today, the history of the company and the man should not be forgotten.